And we're back with section number 2 of The Origin of Species, chapter 22 in the Raven text. And where we left off last time, we were talking about allopatric speciation. Again, if you recall, allopatric means that species are separating into different species based on some kind of geographical isolation. So it's speciation apart from each other, speciation when there is separation in space. So one example of this, as we'll see on the next slide, is something called the little paradise kingfisher, which is in New Zealand. These populations, even though they are in some cases relatively close together in terms of linear distance, that distance is not equal because they're actually separated by ocean in some cases, so they can't cross that by a normal flight sort of a thing. So we see a lot of variation between subpopulations of this individual species. As we talked about before, as we define species, these are all reproductively compatible subpopulations. So if you take this version down here and try to mate with this version up here, they can produce normal offspring that are perfectly viable, perfectly healthy, perfectly fertile as well. If you take these two individuals up here, they would be also perfectly reproductively compatible. But obviously, phenotypically, they look a lot different. And so what you might imagine is as these species are living on these islands out away from the overall mainland, the conditions are different, the climate's different, the food supply might be different, so they start to look different, they start to appear differently. And eventually, if those differences were to accumulate enough, what you might see happening is all of a sudden, if you bring together these two subpopulations at one point in time, possibly they might be reproductively incompatible, at which point they would no longer be considered subpopulations, they would be considered members of the same species. Notice how the mainland population is very, very similar, whether you're up here kind of in the mid part of, I believe I said New Zealand before, it's actually New Guinea, the midland part of mainland New Guinea versus the southern part of mainland New Guinea. These two look relatively similar to us. And so within the overall population of the mainland part of this large island, there's a lot of gene flow. And so free breeding, interbreeding between subpopulations means that they really don't have a chance to accumulate those phenotypic and eventually reproductive differences. All right, so this is kind of a quick model of how allopatric speciation might work. All right, so we have some original population of some species, and we're going to imagine for the sake of this example, these species are not terribly modal, so they're going to be pretty much confined to wherever they are in the environment. And if you'll notice over here, there's a river just to the, I guess, east of our original population, which, as rivers sometimes do, is going to, in a second, divide our mainland population into two subpopulations. Notice also that before the river does that little change, there is gene flow happening freely within this entire population. So any differences that might pop up, any mutations, any different alleles that might pop up, are going to be freely passed with the entire population potentially, so any differences don't really have time to accumulate or the ability to accumulate within the overall population. So our river is now changing course. We've divided our overall original species into two subpopulations, one up here to the northwest, one down here to the southeast. And if you kind of imagine, first of all, one assumption is the species are not going back and forth, so gene flow only happens within subpopulation 1 and only happens within subpopulation 2. Now all of a sudden we've cut off genetically these two subpopulations from each other. So any differences in the environment up there in the northwest or in the southeast are essentially going to build up because there's no gene flow between subpopulation 1 and subpopulation 2. Differences will continue to accumulate, and eventually we might see the formation of separate species. And so even this is a case that's relatively easy to imagine how these differences might accumulate. This is still going to take a really, really long time to happen. Right? So it might take several thousand, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years of individual adaptation in the two respective subpopulations for them to eventually get to the point where they're now separate species. So physical isolation leads to reproductive isolation is kind of the idea here. Upon what we call second contact, when you bring those two subpopulations back together that have been left on their own to develop differences for maybe tens of thousands of years, when you bring them back together and offer them the opportunity to breed to one another or with one another, they won't anymore. We've got some mechanical isolation, temporal isolation, ecological isolation, any one of those pre-zygotic or post-zygotic isolating mechanisms we talked about last time. So now, once that river goes back to what it was, we've taken away our geographic barrier. We've got our two new species, where before we only had one species. Even when they're now adjacent and there is no physical separation between these two subpopulations, there is now reproductive isolation so that they're actually considered separate species. So just to kind of sum up allopatric speciation, what you're going to have is some kind of a geographical boundary. It could be a mountain, it could be a river, it could be an ocean. kind of depends on the species and how mobile they are as to what kind of a barrier might be necessary to isolate two species to the point where there is very, very little gene flow. So little migration, little gene flow. Again, what that means is that differences will continue to accumulate until maybe eventually, just by chance, we get that isolating mechanism that is reproductive in nature and now defines our one species as two separate species. So different isolating mechanisms show up, and then we have eventually two separate species upon second contact. All right, so that's the first type. And there really isn't too much argument about the fact that allopatric speciation occurs. It's such a logical idea and process that very likely it probably is a fairly common way that we get separate species. On the other hand, sympatric speciation has been a lot more controversial, and what you might imagine is, and that's probably not too surprising, because if you have two species developing in the same place, or one population in the same place of one species, how in the world are we going to build up reproductive differences within that one big overall range? If we don't have a barrier to gene flow, those genes in the gene pool are just going to continue to get mixed up over and over and over. Any differences that show up are going to be washed out, and so we never really have any subpockets that are left to develop reproductive isolation. So one species splits into two at a single locality without any geographic isolation. And so one way that we could sort of think about sympatric speciation happening is by when we have a change in what's called the ecological niche of a population or one subpopulation of a species. And so a niche is just sort of like an ecological job or an ecological role. It's what you do in the environment. It's where you live, it's the habitat you occupy, it's when you're active, it's the food you eat, it's the predators that sort of come after you, the parasites that come after you. It's your ecological role in nature. And so it's possible, it's feasible, and in fact it has been documented at least once that if you have a niche shift of one subpopulation of a species, then all of a sudden you could have two species showing up at the same locality. The other, probably somewhat more likely way for this to happen is as a result of what we call polyploidy. Now think back to our chapters on genetics and cell division. We talked about haploid with one set of chromosomes. We talked about diploid with two sets of chromosomes. We mentioned tetraploid, where you've got four sets of chromosomes. Polyploid is basically a situation where you've got an individual organism with greater than two sets of chromosomes, more than two sets of chromosomes, right? So 3 sets, 4 sets, 5 sets, 6 sets. Turns out in animals that doesn't really happen very well. For animals, as we've kind of seen back in the previous weeks, if an animal has extra sets of chromosomes, it's not going to work real well, and it's probably going to die out pretty quickly. Plants, on the other hand, are somewhat more resilient. They are more resistant to being affected very heavily by polyploid type scenarios, so they can actually exist quite happily in the polyploid condition. They can survive, they can grow, they can produce fruits and seeds. The only way they can reproduce, though, is if they happen to come across another individual that has the same number of sets of chromosomes that are compatible with them, and we'll see that here in a few minutes. But this is the classic example of sympatric speciation in a species of animals. So this little fella here in the center of the slide is known as the apple maggot fruit fly. Not the most aesthetically pleasing of names, doesn't really give you a cute and cuddly picture of what this organism is, but this particular organism is a type of fruit fly that lives on, historically, before the arrival of European settlers in the United States, they lived on crabapple trees, or hawthorn trees actually, more accurately. They live on hawthorn trees. So these are hawthorn trees here. Leaves have sort of this arrow-shaped appearance, very sort of well-toothed leaves. These are the fruits. They're actually the same type of fruit as a common apple, so much smaller, much less tasty, much tougher type tissue, but it's the same kind of a fruit that you see with an apple. These Crataegus species, hawthorns, are native to North America. You've seen them probably. They're native to this part of Ohio. They live here fairly commonly. Very, very large thorns occupying the branches, especially the finer branches of these trees. So apple maggot fruit flies and hawthorn trees have lived together in North America for a really, really long time. When European settlers started coming to North America, however, they brought with them one of their favorites, which was the common apple tree. Now, these two organisms, the common apple and the hawthorn, are in the same family. They're both in the rose family. They are both relatively similar genetically, as taxonomy goes. And what so eventually we think happened was that as these apple maggot fruit flies sort of began to come into more contact with these common apple trees, some of them, but not all, there was sort of a little apple maggot fruit fly faction that split off from the rest, and they decided that they were going to go over here and they were going to live with the common apple trees. So European settlers come to North America because they want to live free and have their own choices, I guess, made, and these apple maggot fruit flies sort of do the same thing. They take those plants brought over by the European settlers, and they begin to settle on these. They split off from the other group, the wild type, which is feeding on hawthorns, and some of these go over here to feed on common apple trees. Now, these trees could grow literally side by side within a few feet of each other, but these little flies are not very large, and once a fly is born or is hatched on one tree, it's going to sort of acquire a taste for that particular species of tree. Even though there might be a similar species like hawthorn or common apple growing nearby, they're not going to go to it. They're not going to accept it. They're going to only go to the species that they happen to be born on or hatched on. So even though these two populations or subpopulations of fruit flies may live within a few meters of each other, they actually never come into contact and they never breed. It's more of an ecological type speciation that occurs without any great geographical separation. The other type of sympatric speciation is where you have polyploidy. So one possibility here is you might have what's called autopolyploidy, where perhaps you have a situation in cell division where you have gametes produced or cells produced as a result of mitosis that happen to be tetraploid. So we're going to copy our DNA back in S phase, we're going to run through mitosis or meiosis, and rather than having chromosomes splitting into cells evenly, some cells are going to end up having more sets of chromosomes than others, and those are going to be the tetraploid cells. Now, like I said before, with plants, this works okay. They can actually get by fairly well. They can survive and do quite well in the evolutionary sense of having more sets of chromosomes. But what they can't do is produce fertile offspring with individuals who are diploid. In order to have fertile, viable, healthy plants, you must have the same number of sets of chromosomes coming together in the gamete. So if you have a species with 2 sets of chromosomes trying to breed with a species with 6 sets of chromosomes, that's probably not going to work real well. The second possibility here is you could have what's called allopolyploidy. So we saw allopatric, meaning apart. Allopolyploidy also, in a sense, kind of means apart or separate because we have 2 separate species now that are hybridizing. And so the offspring are still diploid, but they actually have a chromosome set from 2 different species. They're polyploids. And so they can only breed with members of their own hybrid variety. So if they are produced in a hybrid sense, you've got species A and species B producing hybrid C. Hybrid C can only breed with itself. It can reproduce asexually. If it could perhaps come into contact with another hybrid of the same genotype or same number of sets of chromosomes at least, they could breed that way. Or, even more of kind of a stretch here, if you have an allopolyploid situation, that could actually become, or go through an autopolyploid situation, or autoploid situation, and actually become fertile again. So, in that case, we actually have individuals who are hybrids undergoing then a second mistake in the process of doing meiosis or mitosis, and they actually become fertile that way. So 2 mistakes actually lead to a perfectly fertile and viable, separate and brand new species. 2 wrongs make a right, I guess, in that case. Let's sort of look at it that way. All right, so here's the situation. Here's our autoploid situation. We've got species 2 and species 1. This species goes through a situation where we've got 4 chromosomes here. That's diploid. Down here we have 2 chromosomes. That's haploid. That's great. Species 1 over here goes through meiosis 1. So it has 6 chromosomes. It goes through eventually the end of meiosis. It has 3 chromosomes. So its haploid number is 3. We go from 6 to 3 and 4 to 2 in the process of doing meiosis. Now, if these are sperm cells and egg cells, either way, it doesn't really matter which is which. Sperm cells and egg cells, if they fertilize each other up here, we're going to have very, very different chromosomes. We essentially have individual sets of chromosomes from 2 separate species, which is going to make it very, very difficult in some cases, for at least part of the time, to produce healthy gametes. All right. So, again, sympatric speciation is a bit controversial. There are still people who argue very vigorously over whether it's a really common or potent evolutionary force. For a long time, there were biologists who would get in very, very heated, almost to the case where there are physical alterations about whether or not sympatric speciation was even possible or feasible. Most people now accept that it does, but the key to this, again, is that you're living in a place without any kind of geographic separation, but somehow evolving reproductive isolation. All right, so that's another possibility down there at that last bullet point. Polymorphisms, as you recall back, we saw polymorphisms back in our lab on biotechnology. We did a situation where we had our PTC tasting ability. There was a polymorphic version or a different version of that gene, which allowed people to not taste that particular chemical. This is kind of the same thing. A polymorphism is a different variety of a gene, which can be with or held within a population. All right, so sort of going above the species level and going out to several species or even genus and family level, historically in the fossil record, we see things called adaptive radiations. And so this is where you actually have situations in which species start to diversify very, very, very quickly, right? A lot of very closely related species that start to show up in a very short period of time. Most commonly when this happens, we're finding species or have found species which sort of occupied a place or a niche that was unfilled. And so when this new species gets there, they basically have no controls. There are no predators, there are no parasites, there may be unlimited food, and they start to going to diversify very quickly. Different species start to split off, they start to occupy different niches and different resources and use different habitats. And so we start seeing lots and lots of species in a very small place in a relatively short period of time, maybe only a few thousand years instead of 100,000 years. So islands are a great example of this. Those few colonists which happen to make their way out to islands very commonly have very little in the way of competition or natural enemies, so they can start to multiply and eventually diversify very quickly. Hawaiian Islands, lots of unique species that are found nowhere else on Earth, and they've only shown up relatively recently. Galapagos Islands, of course, with Darwin's work, are another one where there is a great variety of finches and other wildlife on the Galapagos that you don't find in other parts of the world. The other type of unfulfilled niche that could kind of show up is when you have some sort of great catastrophic event where you might lose half to three-quarters of the species on Earth. Those survivors, those that make it through the catastrophe and aren't killed off, they essentially have the world to themselves. They're able to go ahead and colonize the niches left behind by everybody else. So they're going to multiply very quickly. They're going to start splitting up the niches to help support more species. And eventually we're going to have a lot of diversity after that time. A third way that adaptive radiations can happen is where you have what's called a key innovation. Okay, so maybe you have a situation where you have a new trait which has never been seen before in the living world. Something like the first terrestrial organisms to exist. Think about what the first vertebrates coming onto land 450 million years ago would have experienced. Would there have been much competition? Probably not. Those first barely able to breathe air types of fishes would have crawled onto land. They would have found some very early primitive plants. They would have found some arthropods, some insects and millipedes and centipedes and spiders on land. Lots and lots of food. Of course, nothing to eat them. These little fish/salamander things are crawling onto land, and they are the top predators. Today, in our environment now, they would have been sitting ducks for everything else on land. But at the time, there was really little else out there. And the same thing when we start seeing the development of wings in birds. Another unoccupied niche that once birds are able to occupy, it allows them to diversify very, very quickly and actually become the second largest of the two vertebrate groups, even though it's a relatively young group. So in this case, again, we've got adaptations, we've got evolution in order to meet or fit the challenges of the environment, and eventually what this leads to is separate species. This picture over here actually goes along more with what we were talking about on the last slide. So here we've got just barely over here on the left-hand side of the top frame of this picture, we have mainland habitat. And somehow this bird is making its way out to the island. Maybe it's blown out to sea in a storm and, sort of bad luck there, but good luck in the sense that it actually happens to find an island to land on rather than being, stuck at sea and dying. They're landing on an island, and from there, they're going to start island hopping. So we go from here, we maybe start to establish a little bit of a population, and eventually we hop down to these other two islands. And since all three of these islands have somewhat different habitat conditions, they're going to have evolution and natural selection affecting the rate of evolution in those different habitats. So eventually what can happen is that this is essentially a key innovation or a founder effect type situation where we're occupying these islands, you're diversifying, and eventually we're getting separate species. So we're evolving into different subpopulations that look different. We're then going to allow these things to cross-colonize the island. So yellow goes to red goes to black goes to yellow, and then reverse also as well. And so eventually, even though we have now sympatric subpopulations on the same islands of all three types, they're no longer breeding together because while they were apart back here, back in part number 4 of this picture, they were on different islands with different conditions, and they changed. They changed physically, they changed behaviorally, they changed physiologically, and eventually, once you bring them back together, because they were apart for so long, they're not going to be able to breed together anymore. All right, we've also talked about character displacement. Character displacement is one of those strategies that some species use in order to avoid or minimize competition. So the basic definition again of character displacement is where you've got two species that when they're together tend to look very similar. But when these two species are apart, they tend to look very, very much alike. So living together, they look very different. I may have misspoken. When they live together, they look very different because they need to be different in order to occupy the same habitat at the same time, doing almost the same kinds of activities. So if they look different in the same place at the same time, maybe they can feed on different food, maybe they can occupy different subhabitats, and maybe they can coexist even though they might be competing. One of the fundamental aspects in any discussion about competition is that how direct competition for the same niche will not go on forever. Eventually, there's going to be a winner. Eventually, one species will be pushed out. It'll either go to extinction or it will sort of leave physically that habitat, and the other species is then the winner. One way of mediating or moderating or minimizing competition is to have character displacement. So when two species are together, they tend to look very much different, and when you take those two species and separate them, they tend to look very much alike. So species diverge because they are together, because they are trying to occupy the same niche, they start to look different, and eventually, in the end, they might become different species. So here's character displacement. Over here on the top left, we have two species who are occupying very much the same niche. The body size is a very much overlapping type feature, which likely means they're feeding on the same kind of food and trying to use the same kind of habitat, and overall really competing quite a bit. And when you have competition, nobody wins. Both individuals, both parties, both species or subspecies are going to be hurt in some way. Maybe not physically, but they might be hurt in terms of the amount of time they have to spend doing other things, the amount of food they're able to gather, the number of mates they can attract, and so forth. So when you're competing and fighting for food, that leaves you less time to do other stuff. The solution to this is have displacement. So these two species, when they live together, if one of them is relatively small, the other one is relatively big, well, now maybe we can have them coexisting in the same habitat at the same time because they're not using exactly the same resources anymore, are they? On the other hand, when you take these two species and put them in different habitats, they're going to tend to stay pretty similar because they're not actually competing with each other in those different habitats. Drosophila fruit flies in the Hawaiian Islands are a great example of founder effect and eventually adaptive radiation. There are a huge number of niches fulfilled by fruit flies in Hawaii because there aren't any other insects to do those kinds of things. At that body size, at that activity level, in those habitats, we have predators, we have herbivores, nectar eaters. Those are not terribly uncommon for fruit flies. I mean, predators is fairly rare. There's also parasitic fruit flies. There are detritivorous fruit flies, which means they eat dead leaves and plants and animals, whatever dead stuff they can find, they eat those. Not really a common niche to fulfill if you're a fruit fly, as being a scavenging type organism or even a predatory or parasitic type organism. So in Hawaii, when these fruit flies first showed up, there was nobody else occupying those niches, and these species were able to take over and take off and diversify. Darwin's finches are another great example of character displacement. When you have islands with the same finches, they tend to look very different. If you take those same two species and move them to different islands, compare our species on different islands, they tend to look very similar. So, different selective pressures means new lifestyles. Islands are the best way to study this because they are truly isolated from other kinds of habitats for the most part. And so these populations, especially if they're bigger, especially if it's a large amount of variability in the gene pool, can lead to much quicker evolution and eventually divergence into separate species on those islands. All right, so here's character displacement in Darwin's finches, right? So take a look at this picture from your book. We actually see species of ground and cactus finches versus tree finches versus the vegetarian tree finch. This is the one that always kind of gets me because there really aren't very many birds that feed on leaves. And I've talked about that before. Leaves, you got to get a bunch of them to have a meal. You got to have a bunch of them to actually get the nutrition you need to make it through your day. And, birds can't afford to eat that much because it makes them heavy and it slows them down, and that's really not the best way to go if you're trying to fly. So even on the Galapagos, there are vegetarian finches, which is a very uncommon sort of a thing. Tree finches actually use tools to get insects out of rotting trees or logs or plants in general. The vegetarian finches with their leaves and bud chewing behaviors. Warbler finches act like warblers in North America. They're basically small, very agile insectivorous birds. And these all are descended from that one ancestral common groundfish species from mainland South America that likely got blown out to sea, or a population of them got blown out to sea, and eventually established viable populations, which then diversified out on the Galapagos Islands.